Hello, well, my name is Dennis Winston. I'm a product of Richmond Public Schools. I lived in Richmond for a while. I was born in Hanover. I spent 38 years in the school district as a retired coordinator for arts and education and as an arts teacher. I've been on the faculties at VMFA, Virginia Museum, Governor School, Virginia State, and I am a printmaker. I have decided that I would spend a lot of time doing these woodcut works, but I'm also a painter. I've been a photographer, so I've kind of played around with a lot of different creative methods in my work. Woodblock printing came about as a result of my having been an educator and having to spend a lot of time working with students, both during the day and after school. And the woodcut provided me an opportunity to do multiple originals of my work, which helped me with my time efforts and having time to work. And I didn't have to have a press. I didn't have to have a lot of complicated materials. I just had my idea, a block of wood, some tools to cut, and I could make these prints. So it was pretty, it's the oldest method of making prints, so it kind of worked out for me. And I had no idea that it would evolve into one of my more recognizable art forms. Well, I have always had an interest in historical issues. Having been an educator, I taught my students a lot about African American arts, African American history. I feel that a lot of the artists that I aspire to be like for instance, Elizabeth Catlett, Jacob Lawrence, people like that tell stories. And once I was involved with a project that I had a chance to meet Elizabeth Catlett, and we talked about her philosophy. She talked about work being able to speak to people, to share ideas, to tell the stories. And so that's what I try to do in my work. Most of the work that I do, since I was an educator, involves subject matter of students. And I try to use those works to provide positive inspiration to the students, either historical issues. I want those issues to be presented in a positive way in that it invites people to ask questions, to engage, to bring their own stories, and at the same time, not really turn people off, but to try to stimulate conversation. Especially in the time of a pandemic, not having access to some of the materials you needed, being locked out of your studios a number of occasions because of COVID scares, and just dealing with all the issues that are surrounded with that we are dealing with recently with Black Lives Matter and the monuments in Richmond. All of those things played into my psychological efforts in providing the time and the motivation to do this project, but knowing that it had a good, it was for a very good reason, I pushed forward and tried to do the project in a way that was a collaboration with the curators and what Wilton wanted out of the project, in creating these 4 images that would help to tell the story of Wilton. Well, my first impression was, to be honest, I knew about Wilton, but I didn't know much in depth. And so when I was asked to look at this, and we went by and looked at some of the artifacts and the idea of archaeology telling the story of the enslaved population on Wilton, I was able to look at some of these artifacts. And as I looked at these artifacts, I reflected back on my own background and my early years spending a lot of time with my grandparents in Hanover on a farm and having discussions about some of the family history and the land that they owned and the first churches that they built and all those kinds of things. And having met with the Wilton staff, and they shared with me some of the ideas of what they were looking for and how so maybe these 4 scenes or vignettes that we were looking to produce. And so that kind of made me pay more attention to the historical significance of Wilton and the fact that the story hadn't been told. But I also knew that based on what I was being told by the curators and the Wilton staff, that I had to look at things such as topographical maps, the location of where certain places were, for instance, how Wilton related to the dockland and the James River, and where the cabins were, where the slaves lived, and where the gardens were. So there were a lot of historical facts that had to be incorporated into this project. Then, as I looked at doing this project, I wanted the figures that I created and the scenes that I created, I wanted them to be more individualized, looking at a way of making them look more like what I think people should look at when they're looking at these images, because a lot of times when I see some of these slave narrative images, they look sort of stereotypical. So I kind of wanted to push the idea of being more individualized and really relating to the human condition and the situation that we know that we're on each plantation were very different, depending on where the plantation was located and depending on who owned that particular plantation and how people were treated on that plantation. So those were some of the factors that I had to look at in creating these images. Well, when you're doing a woodcut, first of all, it doesn't allow for a lot of detail. So in doing this project, I did a lot of studies. I made sketches that would show movement and tools and how people would look. So I did a lot of sketching. And then, of course, I had to look at where things were located, such as the caverns and the gardens and the James River and all of those things. I had to think in terms of some of the tools that we saw. I had to think in terms of how the exterior of some of the cabins would be, and the ideas that what the curators wanted me to look at in creating this. So there were a lot of drawings created. Now, the thing about doing these woodcuts, once I do the drawing is going to be from, say, maybe left to right. But when I actually transfer the drawing to the block, this drawing is going to reverse. So therefore, in creating these blocks, in order to keep things in the right position on the block, I had to make the drawing, the original drawing, and then what I would do is I would trace my drawing and flip it over, and I have to put the drawing on the wood block backwards. So everything that I do on this wood block, the initial drawing is going to be, this figure is facing to the left, and here it's facing to the right. I just do a little bit to show you, and then I roll that ink out. So that's an important part of the process. I can't have the ink too thick, and I can't have it too thin, because I want it to go onto the block. And so what I will do is I will roll this ink all over this block. And I have to be very meticulous in how I do that. And I do it in sections. And the reason I do it a thin layer of ink, because number one, I do not wish to lose all the details that I've created on this particular block. If I put too much ink, it fills in the details. So I want the details. So it's very important how I ink and how I place the paper on the block and how I transfer the block to the paper. So here's one of the blocks in one of the prints. This is the particular block that shows outside the cabin, called The Visit. And you can see it has quite a bit of detail, and you can see how it's actually cut. And then you can see what the print looks like when I actually transfer that. And again, as you look at this, you can see that the image has reversed. So that's what the woodcut is all about. That's how it turns out in the final process. And the process is, I take these little wooden blocks like this, and I sit here and I actually rub and rub and rub to transfer the image from the surface to the paper. Now, to pull this particular block, for each time I make a print, I start in a section and I work. And I also decide how I want to apply the pressure. If I want something really dark, I create more pressure. If I want to be more careful with the detail, then I can lessen the pressure. The paper is translucent, so I actually can see how the image is going to reverse in this process. So for me as a printmaker, my final image and how it looks, the dark areas and the light areas and the areas that I place focus on, is very critical into what I want this print to look like. And so as I rub, it would probably take me 30 to 45 minutes to pull one of these blocks so it's a very time consuming process. First, the drawing on the block, which is the easy part. Then once I put the drawing on the block, it takes quite a bit of time to translate, because you can see this print has quite a bit of detail in it. And so I have to use different tools. Some of my tools have a wide point, some have a very narrow point, and some are like little knives. And so each one of these creates a different kind of line in order that I will get the variety of textures to make this work in this process. And as I said before, it doesn't allow for a lot of detail. So it's kind of like you have to really be very meticulous in your cutting to get little fine areas like the feet and the little stick and the face and the fancy shirt and the buttons and all of that, and the texture in the hair. And the one that was very challenging was this particular one, which shows the family meal. And because there's so much, I'm only using this black and white ink, there's no color. So when I created this, I had to be aware of the texture of the ceiling and the roof, the texture that would represent the interior of the log cabin, and of course the family meal with some of the artifacts such as spoons, plates, wine bottles, a pitcher, a stool, a leather bag, there's a cat there, wooden floor, a hunting rifle, buckets for carrying water and whatever, and a little window here which would give you some light, and also a candle. I put a candle in there for light to try to reflect that. So I wanted to create this family scene. I wanted to create them having a family meal together as a loving family in spite of their condition. And with the idea of the artifacts and some of the things that were hand-me-downs given to them to help them have a better life on the plantation. So this required a great deal of thinking and planning and how to create this image with a limited type of palette and all of that. So this was a very challenging project, but once I got it done, I was kind of happy with the way it turned out, and I was even more happy that Wilton staff appreciated what I had tried to do, and hopefully this will help share the message of the life on Wilton Plantation. I'll say that I'm really happy that when I worked with the staff at Wilton, they were very patient with me, and they explained to me what they were looking for. They gave me some latitude in what I did. They let me know what they were looking for, but they let me find my own direction, and it was sort of a give and take between myself and the staff as to what they were looking for. And then so when I presented them some images, they could say to me and give me feedback about whether or not this is what they were looking for, and if this met the requirements, or if this was really the way the landscape was at that particular time. So this was a really positive collaboration between myself and the Wilton staff. So I really enjoyed that part of it.